So why don't we begin our class? I didn't have a lot of time to prepare, so this is kind of the best I could come up with, but I hope you find it interesting. I want to kind of curtail on the topic of the resurrection, because that's what everyone was focused on last week, of course, celebrating Easter Sunday. Most of Christendom probably was focused on the resurrection of Christ, and even though we were in Reno, I was able to watch the live stream later, and I saw Mike's lesson. He had a really good lesson on the resurrection, and I believe he called it The Day That Changed Everything, and that's a pretty good title because it certainly was the day that changed everything. We say that it's foundational to Christianity, right? It's not just something we believe or theology, but it's a historical event grounded in reality, and that serves as the keystone to Christianity, doesn't it? You can't have Christianity without the resurrection. If you try to remove the resurrection from what Christianity is based on, it doesn't just become weak, it completely crumbles on the floor. You cannot have Christianity without the resurrection. And I just want to make a couple points, kind of explaining that a little more, because sometimes we tend to gloss over the resurrection. We don't really discuss it in depth or look at maybe skeptical claims against the resurrection, which we're going to do today. But my first, well, here's the title, I guess, of the lesson. Live, Die, Repeat. Answering the critics of the resurrection. Got just a fun title we came up with. So my first point is that the resurrection validates who Jesus claimed to be. So let me just ask you guys, you can give me some feedback. What were some of the extraordinary claims that Jesus made during his life? Can you think of anything? He'll be back in 3 days. Okay. It's probably the most extraordinary claim right there. What other things did he claim? I am the Son of God. What else did you say? Yeah, the way, the truth, the life. I'm the bread of life. I and the Father are one. That's another claim he made. Yeah, the only way to the Father. So the exclusive Son of God, the only way to the Father. The I am. He also claimed to have authority to forgive sins, right? So these are all extraordinary claims Jesus made. So if we stop just at the crucifixion, where Jesus was crucified and then he was buried, but then he never rose from the dead, what would happen to this big old group of claims we just talked about? Throw that away. Yeah, it means nothing. So that's why the resurrection is fundamental, we say, to the Christian faith. Because without the resurrection, you have no validation for any of these claims or any of the actions, any of the significance of the sacrifice Jesus made, any of that stuff. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. So my expanded premise is that the message of the gospel can never just stop at the crucifixion. Because if it does just end with Jesus dying and being buried, then there's no good news for us. Even if Jesus, let's say, had performed all these miracles, or if he led people towards God, okay, so what? I mean, ultimately, it would have meant nothing for us if he hadn't been raised from the dead. And the Apostle Paul even states this in a whole bunch of different ways all throughout 1 Corinthians chapter 15. You're probably familiar with that. He makes a pretty compelling case for the resurrection. You know, he says things like, if Christ hasn't been raised, then all of your preaching is futile. All of your preaching is worthless. Your faith even is worthless if Christ has not been raised from the dead. And if it's only for this life that Christ gives us hope, then you should feel sorry for us as Christians, because we are participating in a faith that leads to a dead end. Like literally, it leads to death. It does not lead to life if Christ has not been raised. Okay, and I'm kind of watering down what Paul says. I mean, he makes a very compelling case all throughout 1 Corinthians 15. So again, the resurrection validates who Jesus claimed to be. If he died and if he stayed dead, then all of his claims would be discredited. And anyone can claim divine authority, but rising from the dead, that's the validation. So the resurrection is, in effect, God's public confirmation that everything Jesus said about himself is true. If Christ had not been raised to a glorified and risen body, then here's my comparison. The Gospels would be no better than, what's this guy? Who's this guy? What did he write? Then the Gospels would be nothing different than a Shakespearean tragedy. You guys ever read Shakespeare? Is there ever a happy ending? Is there ever a happy ending to Shakespeare? No, there's not. He's a good writer, yeah. But this is why I cancel him. No. The Gospels are superior in every way because they don't have that kind of sad ending that leads to nothing. We like happy endings, don't we? If there's no resurrection, then there's no Christianity. So without the resurrection, the cross has no proven victory. We all believe that Jesus' death was an atoning sacrifice for sin, but here's the key question. How do we know that it actually worked? Isn't that a good question? How do we know that what he did actually worked and actually accomplished anything? Well, the resurrection is the answer because it shows that the penalty for sin was accepted. It demonstrates his victory over death, and it proves that sin did not ultimately defeat him. So here's a simple illustration that you guys might like. This will help you understand it. The cross is the payment. So what is the resurrection? The receipt. The receipt of the payment. If there's no receipt, how do you know that the payment went through? I think that's a pretty simple illustration to help us remember the importance of the resurrection. Without the resurrection, the crucifixion just looks like a tragic execution or a failed messianic movement. You know, a bunch of small-minded people who are maybe inspired and caught up in the fervor of something that seemed spiritual but ultimately led to nothing. But with the resurrection, it becomes something entirely different, doesn't it? It's a deliberate, victorious act of redemption and salvation that can legitimately give us hope. That's what we all want, right? We want something legitimate to hope in. So everything hinges on this event. And that's why we can never treat the resurrection as something optional, in terms of Christianity. It's at the exact center of the system. It's like the engine of your car or something like that, right? You can't run your car without it. We cannot have Christianity without it. Say that again? Yes, very good. Right. Yeah, exactly. Very good point. Okay, so I'll go back to the title real quick. I kind of just hinted at the title. Now, the title of this class is not something I actually came up with. Live, Die, Repeat. If you guys are familiar with this movie, it was popular 10 years ago or something like that. It's a pretty good movie. I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but essentially the premise of this movie is that this guy is living a day and then dying, and then he lives the day over again and again so he can learn from his mistakes, and so ultimately he can save civilization or whatever. And the key to this is that he has to convince other people of his extraordinary claim that he's really living the day over and over, and he has to get people to believe him, and it's kind of interesting. And I kind of make the analogy of saying that our job is almost the same, to convince other people, or at least to give them reasons to believe in the extraordinary claims of the gospel, right? Because it is extraordinary. I mean, why do we say that out of all the people who have ever lived and died, no one has ever raised back to life in a resurrected body except for Jesus? That's a hard claim to, give evidence or reasons for. Excuse me. So there are a lot of people who come up with reasons not to believe in the resurrection, and I thought maybe today we could just go over a couple of the skeptical claims that people throw out there and maybe see why, at least in my opinion, I don't think they're very good arguments or very good reasons. It's usually atheists making these claims, but sometimes it's agnostics as well. People who are not sure whether or not they do believe in a God. And as a side note, I was listening to I think it was Mike Lacona the other day, who was doing a seminar on the resurrection, and it sounded like he kept saying eggnog sticks. Eggnog sticks. I was like, is that like a belief in eggnog or something like that? He was talking about agnostic people. I didn't get that at the time. Yeah. So based on everything I've read, it actually seems like the majority of what they call scholars and historians, even many of whom are not believers, agree and affirm that Jesus of Nazareth was a legitimately real historical person. Now that may be surprising to us and leave us with the question, okay, so if they acknowledge that he was a historical figure, what do they do with the resurrection? It's a good question. So there's a lot of arguments they try to put forth to discredit the resurrection. And here's the first one we're going to talk about. It's called the swoon theory. Anyone ever heard of this? The swoon theory. You ever swooned over anyone? I think my wife swooned over me before, right? Just kidding. Yeah. Okay. Right, I think the literary world has kind of seen an explosion of like near-death experiences, or people, talking about what it was like when they were dead and brought back to life or whatever. So let's talk about what this theory is. This is the theory that essentially proposes that Jesus did not actually die on the cross. The Romans tried to execute him, but it turns out he didn't die. He merely just passed out, or he fainted, essentially. Maybe he's in a coma or a state of shock. And then later he revived in the tomb. Now this always reminds me of the movie The Princess Bride. Remember where the character Wesley, you know what I'm going to say. Wesley is basically being killed at the hands of a torturer, and his body is taken back to Miracle Max. And what does Miracle Max say? Yeah. He's not dead, he's just mostly dead. There's a big difference between mostly dead and all dead. Kind of a funny way of pointing out just kind of how ridiculous the idea is. In 1965, Hugh Schonfield published a long volume titled The Passover Plot. And in this popular book, he contended that Jesus deliberately plotted his crucifixion and subsequent resurrection. I had a couple quotes from the book that I'm going to skip, but essentially, he's arguing that Jesus conspired even with the Roman soldiers, and they gave him some kind of drug, and he knew he was going to be crucified, and so this drug would make him appear as if he was dead for some time, and they would secretly nurse him back to health afterwards. It essentially makes no sense and creates more questions than it answers anything. Rather than suffering fatal torment, supposedly Jesus merely swooned on the cross. And then some other unidentified Jew helps Jesus throughout this whole plan. And anyway, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And then in the early 1800s, there were other quite liberal theologians who were attempting to explain away miracles of the Bible with more naturalistic reasoning. And so they pioneered this idea that Jesus merely fainted on the cross, and then he came out of his grave a few days later to live out the rest of his life in hiding, which still makes zero sense. There are other variations of this theory. Even if you look at Islam, most Muslims do not believe that Jesus actually died on the cross either. The strange thing about Muslim theology is that they believe Jesus created someone else, God created someone else to look like Jesus, and that person was crucified on the cross instead, and it's just, again, what's the point of it? I mean, it makes zero sense. If you ask the right questions, you're going to see it just leads to nothing. But before I give my full response to this theory, what do you guys think about that? How would you answer someone claiming that Jesus could have just fainted on the cross? Maybe he never actually died. Yeah, Peter.
Except that
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Just real quick, Proverbs 30, verse 5. Every word of God is pure. He is a shield to those who put their trust in him. Do not add to his word, lest he reprove you, and you be found a liar.
Okay.
So God said it, it's true. Man can come up with whatever stupid stuff he wants to, you know.
Mm-hmm.
He said it, foolishness comes from the heart and so on. But anyway,
Yeah.
God said it. He said it's true, so it's true. And he's just hoping that people will believe it and
Yeah.
act on it.
Yeah, good point. So the first way I would kind of respond to this type of theory is just to talk about the nature of a Roman crucifixion and how it worked. Because if you know about how a Roman crucifixion works, it's essentially impossible to lose consciousness and stay alive for more than 10 to 15 minutes. Because staying alive during the crucifixion requires multiple things to be going on. Like you have to have the muscle stamina and the ability to control your breathing and enable yourself to exhale. And there's a lot of things that are just impossible if you're unconscious. Because when you're on the cross and your arms are nailed there, you're constantly having to push up, and you have to, expand your diaphragm just to be able to exhale. And that's how crucifixion kills people. It's primarily by slow suffocation, and it's the shock that your body goes through. So when a person's hanging there in that vertical position, it's a very agonizing process resulting in slow death by asphyxiation. The stresses on the upper body muscles, like I was saying, and the diaphragm put the chest into what's called an inhaled position. And in order to exhale, the individual must constantly be pushing up with his feet so that the tension on the muscles would be eased for a moment. You can't do that when you're unconscious, can you? That's the problem. I think a lot of people never realize that. And in doing so, the nail would tear through the person's foot, eventually locking up against the tarsal bones. And after managing to exhale, the person would then be able to relax down and then finally take another breath in. So again, he'd have to push himself up just to exhale. And remember, this is after a flogging, so your back has been shredded to pieces and you're pushing up and down on the coarse wood of the cross. So another thing to keep in mind. This would go on until finally the person is completely exhausted, and then they're not able to push up anymore, and that's what eventually leads to their death. There's also a process, let's see if it's on here. Yeah, it's called respiratory acidosis. And that's another effect. When you cannot exhale properly, and the carbon dioxide essentially is being dissolved within your blood, and it's increasing the acidity of your blood, and that causes your heart to react differently. And so your heart's beating erratically, and just everything's going haywire. And I think this is probably why Jesus is able to say, at the very end of his life, "Lord, into your hands I commit my spirit," before he essentially dies of cardiac arrest, because he feels all these different things going on, and he can feel his heart kind of going out of control. So with all these things said, I think you can understand why losing consciousness is really not a valid claim, because prolonging the duration of the cross absolutely requires that the victim be conscious and in full control of his ability to push up and down. An unconscious victim would die very rapidly, and every expert I've read says between 10 and 15 minutes. Okay, so it would be very quick. We know that irreversible brain injury happens with just a couple minutes of depriving your brain of oxygen, right? It's only like 4 to 6 minutes. Okay, so I think that's the first problem with the swoon theory. In addition to the painful torment of the cross, everything Jesus experienced prior to the crucifixion would have left his body extremely traumatized and vulnerable already. Now, what was it that happened to Jesus' body before he even was was nailed to the cross. What was it? What did the Romans do to him? Yeah, the scourging. We call it flogging or scourging, where the Romans would take this flagrum, it's called. It's like a leather set of straps with bone and metal attached to the end. And two of the soldiers would beat the victim almost to death, and it'd be ripping into their back. And sometimes it went so deep that you could see the person's rib cage even. I mean, a lot of people actually died just from the flogging itself before they even got to the cross. That's how terrible this was. And so you could see that even before he's on the cross, Jesus' body is broken. It's vulnerable. His heart and his blood loss even has resulted probably in going into shock. That's probably why, when he's carrying the crossbar, he almost can't even walk. He has to have someone help him. And by the way, we don't think he's actually carrying the entire cross, right? Because it's way too heavy. So they would carry the crossbar that they would then mount onto the vertical beam. But even that itself is probably about 100 pounds. And yeah, you can carry that, but not very well after you've almost been beaten to death. Okay, so that's what's already happened to Jesus before he's even been placed on the cross. So he would have to survive both this flogging and this brutal execution, somehow be nursed back to life. It just doesn't make sense. It's just not possible. Okay, and before he died, the hypovolemic shock would have caused a sustained rapid heart rate, resulting in the collection of fluid in the membrane around the heart, called a pericardial effusion. And they believe the same thing actually happens around the lungs too, where the sac around your lungs would fill with fluid. That's called a pleural effusion. And the reason this is significant, why I even bring it up, is because if you go to John's gospel, when John is recording what happens with the Roman soldier confirming Jesus' death, I think you mentioned it already, where does he thrust the spear into Jesus? Exactly, yes. It's believed that it's through the rib cage and through a lung. And then when he pulls it out, what does John record is seen? Blood and water. And that's exactly what would be expected from that pericardial effusion. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, go ahead. Say that again. Oh, well, I wasn't going to do that, but I think what you're probably referring to is the anxiety, the extreme amount of anxiety Jesus felt in the Garden of Gethsemane, and how that would essentially enlarge the capillaries, and that's why it said something about sweating drops like blood. There was probably some blood already mixed in with what he was secreting. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah, I didn't have that in my notes, but I do recall reading that before. Yeah, it's pretty amazing everything he was able to endure. So a skeptic might point out that, well, these are just first century Romans. They're primitive in their understanding of physiology or anatomy. So how do we know that the soldier wasn't just mistaken when he said, okay, Jesus is definitely dead? Like you said, they didn't break his legs like they did to other people because they noticed he's already dead. How do you respond to that? I mean, to me, that's not a very good argument either, because I don't think you have to be a medical professional. The Romans excelled in killing people. That was their expertise. They know when a person's dead or not. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. Yep. And I think there was a note in one of the Gospels that Pilate was actually surprised that Jesus was dead already, because sometimes crucifixions could last maybe 12, 15 hours, sometimes even over a day, and yet because of the brutal beating and everything else Jesus had gone through already, his body just could not handle anymore. Yeah, yeah, that's another good point. Their reputation and their life hinges on whether or not they're accurately saying he's dead. Because if it turns out Jesus is not dead, those Roman soldiers will be put to death afterwards once they find out. If you remember what happens to Peter in the Acts account, when Peter is let out of prison, who gets killed? Several of the Romans are executed because they didn't have any choice in the matter. The angel came in and broke Peter out of prison, but yeah, that was just someone in prison. So yeah, Peter?
Yeah, the other interesting thing, when Jesus died, it was what happened, the thundering and lightning and everything, nature.
Yeah.
God the Father said nature is saying something unusual has happened.
Yeah. Did you have something, Jim?
You're looking like Christ with his own life. Do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He wait for that process to finish.
Right.
He said,
Yeah.
Father, so he wasn't, this is, even the cross is a victory.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't, in the final analysis, he wasn't at the mercy of the Roman soldiers.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Absolutely.
He, one has to be killed. He said,
Mhm. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Let me just grant the hypothetical and allow this idea that Jesus somehow did survive the ordeal of the cross, that he never actually died. So let's say he's somehow carefully transported back to some safe place, and then he's gradually nursed back to health. The real question here is, how would this inspire any of the disciples to go out and say, hey, y'all, he's the Lord of death. He overcame death. Like, this is the Lord of life right here. How would that inspire anyone to if they knew and they saw Jesus, in this pathetic, broken state where he's barely hanging on to life, to say, this is the Lord of life himself? I think there's a huge problem there, isn't it? It just doesn't make sense. This would not inspire anyone. As an aside, even the Jewish leaders, if you read an account of what they say in Matthew 27, they refer to what Jesus said and quote, while he was alive. So even the Jewish leaders, interestingly enough, by what they said, are verifying that he actually did die. So if you look in the Gospels, you can find all kinds of details like that. Let's see how much time we have left. Yeah, go ahead, Peter.
And you have to remember, you had Jewish leaders and their spies standing there to make sure
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
he died.
Right. Yeah, very good. So after all this physical abuse and blood loss and trauma, Jesus would have looked so pathetic that the disciples probably just would have felt sorry for him. They wouldn't proclaim him as the Lord of anything. His followers never would have built up the church. They never would have changed personally, and became so bold in their faith. And my kind of final statement on this is that a barely alive Jesus doesn't create bold disciples. He creates the need for a doctor. Okay, so those are just a couple of reasons, and there's a lot more reasons we could go into, but we're not. We're going to cancel the swoon theory today and say that it fails. It's not a good theory at all. Okay, moving on quickly. The next theory is that the disciples themselves were the body snatchers, that they somehow simply took the body and did something with it. Nobody knows. And as a fun fact, I think it might have been Mary Magdalene who actually first put forth the idea that Jesus' body had been taken from the tomb. Now, if you remember in John's account, John records in chapter 20, "Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, 'They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him.'" I just thought that was kind of an interesting idea, that even one of the disciples kind of had that idea already, didn't they? Maybe that's where other people stole the idea once they heard her saying it. I don't know. But when people suggest this theory, I wonder if they fail to see the catch-22 that they're creating when they say things like this. Because the intriguing unintended consequence of this claim is that it presupposes the empty tomb. So it's not all that different from the biblical account of the Jewish antagonists at the time, because we know what they were already trying to say in Matthew chapter 28. Do they deny that the tomb was found empty? They don't. What do they say about what the disciples did? Yeah, in fact, they don't just say it, but who do they bribe to go around the city and say it? The guards, the Roman guards, who had come back and reported to them that the tomb was empty. Okay, so there's different levels of verification, even from the Jews and the Romans themselves, that the tomb was empty. And then they had to concoct a story to kind of cover their behinds, so to speak. So it's also a bit odd to me that they didn't try to coerce a public confession out of any of the disciples themselves, which they easily could have done if they truly believed that the disciples had stolen the body. Okay, why didn't they do that? Or if they legitimately knew what happened to the body, well, why couldn't they produce it? Why couldn't they parade it around Jerusalem to prove that he hadn't really risen? It's another good question, I think. Why not interrogate the disciples? Why not find out where they put the allegedly stolen body? You know, if you think about some of the disciples who were later thrown in jail in Acts, were thrown in jail just for preaching Christ resurrected. Okay, well, if they jail them for that, why didn't they jail them, or why didn't they do something more severe if they thought they actually took the body? It doesn't make any sense. Yeah, Peter.
And you've been talking about it all along. If Pharisees thought the soldiers had let them try to steal the body, those soldiers would have been killed.
Yeah, that's what's kind of surprising in that account. I wonder what eventually happened to those soldiers, if they kind of took care of them after the fact. We don't know. Yeah. Right. So I wonder if they took the money and then split, got out of Jerusalem after that, maybe. Who knows? Maybe we'll find out someday. And another thing this claim cannot explain is that this cannot explain away all of the appearances of Christ to numerous people. You see that? Remember, we have all these accounts, Christ appearing to the various women at the tomb, to any of the disciples on different occasions, to Peter. Paul mentions 500 people, and then even Paul himself, of course. A stolen body does not inspire people to lie about seeing a risen Jesus. And nor would it compel anyone to die for something that they knew was an absolute lie. That as well, it makes no sense. You know, people can die for a lie when they mistakenly think it's the truth, but who's ever going to die for something that they know to be a lie? I've never found someone like that. I don't know that that person exists. Maybe they do, but I've never seen it. So consider also the tomb was guarded and the tomb was sealed because the Jewish leaders already approached Pilate, and they said that they were afraid that the disciples were going to steal the body. So they were already kind of playing around with this idea. And that's when Pilate allowed them to kind of utilize that double layer of protection. They would seal the tomb, and he gave them, it seems, like a Roman guard to be there for a while, which mysteriously somehow failed. We don't have an explanation of how that could have happened, but supposedly the guards failed. Now, there also would have been no motive for the disciples or anyone else to do this. All of the severe penalties would have outweighed anything they could have potentially gained by stealing Jesus' body. There's no power play here. There's no way to leverage this. There's no way to exploit this for monetary gain. There's no way to gain any spiritual comfort from stealing the body. So again, what's the motivation? I've never seen a good answer to that question. The improbability of the demoralized disciples overpowering armed guards and then somehow managing to move the stone unnoticed and without a commotion is probably why nobody really tries to use this theory very often. And I've even seen theories that the guards were asleep. And if you think about it, it only takes a second. If the guards were asleep, who was a witness to who stole the body then? How would you even know? People who are asleep cannot testify to anything, unless maybe someone's sleepwalking and they're semi-conscious or something like that. I mean, so even that theory, I think, to me is nonsense. And lastly, on top of that, there's no textual evidence in the New Testament that the disciples ever expected or believed that Jesus was actually going to be resurrected. In fact, there's evidence exactly the opposite. There's quite a bit of evidence that, number one, they doubted. Number two, even when the risen Christ approached them, they hesitated, right, to believe. They had trouble believing it. They had trouble understanding what was going on at the time. And you can read examples in Matthew 28, John chapter 20. And then one last note. It fails to explain why the alleged body snatchers would have taken the time to unwrap the linen garments and then carefully fold them, leaving them in the tomb, and then later the disciples come and they act surprised, right? Peter and John act surprised. Well, why would they be acting surprised if they were complicit in what had happened? And if they're snatching the body and getting out of there as quickly as possible, that doesn't leave any explanation for why these garments were carefully folded up and left in the tomb. It doesn't make any sense either. All right, so I think that's enough. Any last comments on this one? Because we're going to cancel it. We're going to cancel that forever till the end of time. No one ever talk about this theory again, please. Okay, one more real quick because we're almost out of time. The wrong tomb theory, or the wrong rock theory. Those who witnessed the empty tomb of Jesus supposedly were just at the wrong location. Okay, now how do we respond to this? You guys are laughing already. We haven't even responded to it. There's a very, very simple response, really. Yes, thank you. Okay. Every single gospel account records the two Marys, at least, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, as being present when Jesus was buried. Okay? So they were there when the body was being placed in the tomb. They know exactly where it is. Okay? Who else knows exactly where it is? Joseph of Arimathea. It's his tomb. It's a brand new tomb. He owns it. He knows exactly where it is, and he's there to help put Jesus' body in the tomb. Okay, so that's another person. And there's probably also other women with the two Marys. One more person. You guys know who it is? I had forgotten this. Well, God, yes, but Nicodemus. Nicodemus is mentioned in John's account when they're preparing the spices and things for Jesus. He's with Joseph of Arimathea. So again, there's another person. All these people know exactly where the tomb is. So this really doesn't make a lot of sense, and I don't think anyone probably takes this theory very seriously. And of course, there's also additional details, I believe, in John's account that specify the location of the tomb. Where is it? In proximity to what happened. It says it's very close to where the crucifixion site was. Okay, so this isn't some large area, as big as Folsom or something like that. This is a very small, confined area. and it's within a garden, so there's a massive rock structure there that the tomb was a part of. Okay, so this would not be hard to find. Well, I kind of ran out of time here. I had one more. You guys can investigate this on your own. It's called the hallucination theory. You ever heard of that one? That all these different disciples at different times and different places somehow miraculously experience the same hallucination. And what is the problem with that? What's the problem with people supposedly sharing a hallucination? It's never been documented to have happened. It's never been scientifically proven that anyone can share the same hallucination. Because remember, a hallucination is not an illusion. It's not based on something that's actually there. It's nothing is there, and your mind is creating a reality around it. And so hallucinations are unique to each person, and they can come from, I mean, they are real. Hallucinations do happen. But you cannot interact with a hallucination as the disciples did. When Jesus is with the disciples and he says, look, see, touch me. I think I have that verse on here, actually. And then he eats the fish, and the fish disappears. A hallucination cannot explain away things like that. Cannot explain away tactile experiences that the disciples had with the risen Lord. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's a very good point. Right. Yeah. Yeah, everyone in Jerusalem had known exactly what happened. Okay, guys. Well, I mean, we kind of had some fun through those, but I think it is a serious topic, and I hope that I piqued your interest in that if it's not something you've looked into before, because we should always be ready to give an answer to people, and this is just one area of that. So, we're out of time, but I thank you very much for your attention this morning.